Episode 21 of the New England Sports Media Podcast features Steve Buckley, columnist for The Athletic Boston, and soon to join us, Jerry Crasnick, who is out saving dogs, but will be with us soon. Steve, how's it going?
I'm doing fine. All things, I don't want to get no political rant, but I'm happy with the weekend and happy with my work. And it's 72 degrees out. And I'm going to take the dogs out for a walk as soon as we're done with this exercise.
Right on, right on. Well, we're glad to have you with us. We're going to talk a lot when Jerry gets on about kind of what you guys did together back in kind of the earlier portion of your career up here in Maine, where I am, obviously. But for now, I guess we might as well talk about some other stuff. First thing, I think it would be worthwhile talking about the ethos of this podcast is kind of how you do media and media coverage. Big sports news in Boston recently was Alex Cora getting rehired. Curious how you kind of have evaluated coverage of that situation and what you have done to cover that, and maybe experiences in the similar from the past that come to mind.
Well, it's an interesting case because he was manager obviously a couple of years ago and managed the Red Sox to its best season in history, most regular season wins. They roared through the postseason. They beat the Dodgers in 5 games in the World Series. I knew Alex as a player. I have huge respect for his resume in that he grew up with the game in Puerto Rico. His father was a radio broadcaster during Winter League games. Obviously, his older brother Joey played in the majors, and I've always admired Alex. He has a real deep in the belly love and understanding of the game, and to say nothing of the fact that he was a great guy to deal with both as a player and a manager. Now, that's all complicated because he was hired out of the Houston Astros. He was their bench coach when they were up to their eyeballs in the cheating scandal in 2017. Cora was a major player in that and was suspended for an entire season, which ultimately cost him his job as manager of the Red Sox. And now he comes back. And I've been getting crushed on the comments because all I've said is it's complicated. And if you listen to the radio yesterday on Ivan Station, if you talk to anybody who was talking baseball, you can't talk about Alex Cora being named manager of the Red Sox without the baggage that goes along with that. And that's going to be prevalent, assuming that we get open ballparks in 2021 rather. Red Sox cheaters. I mean, the New York, either the Post or the Daily News already has played up cheating Alex Cora is getting his job back. So all I said was that's complicated. That's not press conferences. When a new guy takes over, they tend to be celebratory, happy occasions. You hold up the new shirt. The guy says, I'm going to be a great communicator. This is my dream job. And on it goes. This is different.
So I'm curious, like with Cora, maybe other stuff in the past, whether it's the Red Sox or covering anything else as a columnist, obviously you can say what you want, you can write what you want. When it comes to any sort of scandal or anything like that, any sort of controversial thing, how do you go about writing about it as a columnist and sharing your opinion? Is it just whatever you think you go, or are there other considerations you make when it's something more controversial?
Well, the nature of the job is opinion. And your job is to say, okay, this is how I feel about a certain topic. And if you begin to deviate from that to make other people happy or comfortable or so forth, then you're writing press releases. So I would say that most of what I write is sort of in keeping with how the masses feel. Every once in a while, I feel differently and I write that, and then you accept the reality that people aren't going to be happy with it, but that's the nature of the job. That's why I have this job, because I'm willing to handle that. If you were handed a job as a columnist, and by the way, the Athletic columnist is only part of what I do. You've read me. I write very long takeouts, which is really at this point in my career is much more satisfying because you can do a deep dive into stories. But vis-a-vis the columns, you can't shy away from the criticism that comes your way when you take an opinion. You have an opinion that might not be popular. So I do that and accept the barbs that come with it. Again, I'm okay with them hiring. I'm simply pointing out that this is not a normal situation.
Yeah, and over time, as a columnist, I'm sure your opinions change. Do you feel comfortable maybe flip flopping on an opinion within your columns over time, or when you make an opinion, do you tend to stick with it over
Oh no,
years or however long that player's there?
no. If you have an opinion and you write the opinion, and then the course of events that follows guides you to the reality that either you were wrong or new information has been provided, that the circumstances have changed. And I'll give you a recent example. Was after the 2019 season. They held a press conference after the season was over, in which during the press conference, it was after the 19th season. Sam Kennedy, the CEO of the Red Sox, in passing, mentioned a modest ticket price increase. And this was at a time when they didn't make the playoffs in 19. John Henry was talking about salary constraints and the possibility that Mookie Betts would be traded, which he was. And in a column I wrote, I didn't write the whole column about the ticket price increase, but I did say, and oh, by the way, you mentioned the ticket price increase, and let's not get too caught up in that, because that's what teams do, and that's let's keep our eyes on the prize here and so forth. And well, and then they traded Mookie, then they did this and they did that, and the whole thing was a calamity. I went back and wrote, I said, I was wrong. The optics were really bad. It was a horrible season. They made a number of catastrophic moves that I disagreed with. I wrote a piece at the end of the 18 season prioritizing impending free agents and how they should move forward with signing those. I had Chris Sale at the very bottom. Do not sign this guy. I love him. He's awesome. He's fun to watch. He's a soldier, blah, blah, blah. I don't trust his arm. I had the very top, Mookie Betts. Well, they signed Chris Sale to this, I thought was a bad contract extension, because he has the surgery, misses all of this season, will miss half of next season. He may yet live up to some of that. But so I went back and I revisited that, and I said, I was wrong to say that they shouldn't, that the ticket price increase was not a big deal. It was a big deal. It was bad optics on their part, and they shouldn't have slid that in there. So I have no issue revisiting previous columns I've written and adjusting.
So you kind of alluded to sort of your role at the Athletic. I know you've talked about this like when you came into our class, and you've probably talked about this a million times, but can you kind of describe the biggest differences or the differences in your role going from the Boston Herald to the Athletic, and what that experience and transition, maybe not even a transition anymore, what just the experience is like now?
Well, I mean, some of it is clerical stuff that I don't think your listeners would have a lot of interest in, or maybe they would. But for instance, when I was at the Herald, if I covered a night game, like a Sox-Yankees game, and I was assigned to write a column off the game, I would have to get there early and write what's called an early column or a plug column, because the Boston papers have edition runs. They have a first edition. Those are papers that go to outlying areas. If you were to buy a Boston Herald, the Boston Globe in Southern Maine, for instance, you would get the early edition. So what you'd get is a column I wrote before the game, and you try to write it in a timeless fashion. Maybe something on tomorrow's starting pitcher. Maybe the Yankees have a former Red Sox player on their team I could write a piece about. And that column is going to magically go away, because I'll write a new column after the game representing what happened in the game. The early column might be saved. They might cut it down into a sidebar. They might run it inside somewhere, or just toss it out. So now I'm not limited to the constraints of newspaper deadlines. I can write one column after the game and put a lot of time into it. And I'll give you a classic example of how that works to my betterment. When the Bruins were in the playoffs a few months ago, and Charlie Coyle had a big game, and he tipped the puck into the net, and it was the second time he'd done that in the postseason. People were making analogies to bunting in baseball. And Charlie said during the post-game presser, which was on Zoom, he said, "Oh, it's a good thing I played Little League in Weymouth." So I immediately said, I got to get what would be a fun column to track down his Little League coach from his Weymouth days. And I'm immediately calling everybody I know in baseball to try to go, a person who knows somebody from the Weymouth Little League, because obviously I don't know anybody in the Weymouth Little League. And I was frustrated. I couldn't reach anybody. I called my editor. In this case, it was Dan Barbarisi, who's the second Boston editor. And he said, Buck, you don't write for newspaper. If you want to wait until the morning, maybe some of these guys will call you back. You can write the column at 7, 8 in the morning. And it's like 1 in the morning at this point. I'm calling you at 1 in the morning trying to find a Little League coach. I went to bed. I get up at 6:30. Sure enough, I'm getting text messages and phone calls from 3 or 4 different people. They guided me to a guy who guided me to Charlie Coy's Little League coach. And I got him, oh, he was a great player, boom, boom, boom. He did. And it wasn't the most important story I've written in a while, but it was fun, it was entertaining, and it was different. And I was able to write that column, bang it out in an hour, and it got online by 9 a.m. And that's a very small but significant difference with writing for The Athletic and Vertical as opposed to writing for old-fashioned newspapers.
So when you are divvying up your time in like a very more busy sports time, like right now, obviously only the Patriots are playing, but like in a time where you have all these different things going on, whether it's Celtics, Bruins at the same time or whatever. Obviously, I know you're a huge baseball guy, and we're a baseball beat writer. But how do you kind of like divvy up your time? Is it whoever's in the playoffs? Is it as a Boston columnist and a Boston writer? How do you kind of decide where you want to go with things and what subjects you want to cover?
Some of that's decided by my editor. So, in fact, I just got off the phone with my editor 10 minutes ago about how I'm going to be doing my work the next couple of days. And that's a big part of it. It's just communication. It's you want to be forward looking and see, okay, what's happening, what's upcoming. I do a lot of history-based pieces, but they're history-based pieces that have some connection with what's going on now. And so you need to, I think the easy answer is you keep your ears and eyes open to what's happening in the area. You obviously watch the games. I mean, I'll be watching the Pats Jets game tomorrow night and writing about it. But even if they said, "Oh, we don't need you to write on this," I'd be watching it. I watch probably 80% of Red Sox games, and if I'm not watching the Red Sox, it's only because I'm traveling or something else is going on. And I watch part of most Bruins and Celtics games, and that's not because I don't have interest in the Bruins and Celtics, but it's just the way the schedule works. Baseball isn't really super important. You have, I'll take you through the year. In January, you're usually doing the Patriots in the playoffs. That becomes the focal point. If they go to the Super Bowl, which has been fairly often in recent years, that takes you up to the first or second week of February. Then I go to spring training for a couple of weeks because the Red Sox have pitchers and catchers. Then I come back from that. Red Sox cease to become important. I do the Bean Pot sometimes in February if I'm not at the Super Bowl. But March is generally when I start doing more Bruins and Celtics. April, I'll do opening day at Fenway. And then I'm basically all Bruins and Celtics until both teams are done. So that gets me through May usually, sometimes into early June. Then I pick up the Red Sox for the rest of the summer. Training camp in July, I'll do some Patriots. Me personally, the media in general goes big on the Patriots as soon as they open the season. I do all their games, but my focus is generally the Red Sox. When I was at the Herald, I do the World Series every year, so that takes me through October. And then as soon as baseball is over, it is all Patriots for me, November, December, January. So that's how it works for me. Another writer who's like, say, more basketball centric might tell you a different story, but that's my schedule.
And you mentioned too, kind of keeping your eyes on everything that's going on locally. How important do you find like social media to you?
Oh, it's pretty important in terms of getting my message out. I'll put my column on Twitter and Facebook and so forth because I have my followers and I want my followers to read the stuff that I write and also other stuff from The Athletic. But yeah, you do keep abreast of what's happening. I scroll through Twitter like everybody does. I don't engage as much. I don't get in fights on Twitter because it just turns into those arguments are not winnable. And I might make a point here or there, but if it begins going back and forth, um, it's more, I'm more interested in using my time in a different direction. And I'm okay if I post a column on Twitter, oh, this sucks, like, that's fine. I have no issue with that. But I'm not going to come back and say, oh yeah, I mean, that's just, then your day is gone.
Yeah.
So how do you go about, or how have you gone about, I mean, since, I guess, being a columnist slash your role at The Athletic, in terms of how much time do you spend like source building and talking to people like that versus how much time do you spend just like when something happens, like the Charlie Coyle thing, then you go find someone? Like where what's the balance of that?
You know, it's you kind of wrap it up in some very pretty language there by calling it source building. I called it just being very gregarious and gossipy, and I love talking with people. And I play a little game where I meet somebody, the very first thing I want to do is find the commonality. And if I may borrow you for a moment, I will provide a very vivid example. I do this every day of my life. How many steps does it take to find the people we know and the shared experiences that we have? So, for everybody who doesn't know, Greg is a Boston University graduate. He was in a class with, as is Liam, and I visited Shira Springer's class. And when I learned that your name was Greg Levinsky and that you were from Maine, I lived in Maine for 7 years. I worked for the Portland Press Herald. The biggest clothing store in Maine for jeans and boots and hoodies and casual clothing was Levinsky's on Congress Street, Lower Montjoy Hill. And when I asked if you had any connection with that, lo and behold, that's your family's business, or was your family's business for many, many years. And I bought jeans and hoodies and caps and hats and gloves and construction boots and all this stuff that one would wear in Maine during the relative years. So now you could just as easily have said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm from Brunswick. I'm not from Portland. I've never heard of Levinsky's store. And then we move on to something else. But that's how I conduct my affairs. And to go back to the Charlie Coyle thing, the reason I was able to track down Charlie's Little League coach is because I knew a guy who knew a guy. And it's as simple as that.
So take us up through your kind of arc. I know we've gone over it you and I, but take us through like from UMass to today, like where you're at from Tacoma to Portland to everything.
I mean, do you want the resume or?
Give the listeners just like the quick, basically before the Herald. I think is because I think almost everyone listening would know you from the Herald and the Athletic, but like
Herald. Graduate of UMass 1978, proud alum of the UMass Daily Collegian. Got my first newspaper job at the Westfield Evening News out west of Springfield. I worked there for a year as sports editor. I left there after 1 year in September of 79. I went to the Journal Tribune in Biddeford, Maine as a news reporter. I didn't think I wanted to work in sports at that point. I was covering the towns of Shapley, Acton, Newfield, North Berwick, and Lebanon, working out of the Sanford Bureau. A few months later, the sports editor, Alan Lessels, went to the Portland Press Herald. They offered me the job because I had been sports editor in Westfield, and the money was good, as in from $170 a week to $200 a week. It was a big jump. And so I became sports editor. We hired Jerry Crasnick just out of BU, who will be joining us in a moment. And then Jerry and I worked there for a year. And within a month of each other, we both went to the Portland Press Herald. We were there for 5 or 6 years. I went to the Tacoma News Tribune to cover the Seattle Mariners, then the Hartford Courant for 2 years, 1 year covering the Yankees, 1 year covering the Red Sox. And then the National Sports Daily hired me. I was a baseball writer, general baseball writer, and then the Boston columnist. They went out of business in 91. I mostly worked in freelance as a magazine writer for a year or so. I was hired by ESPN on ESPN Sports Night on ESPN2 with Keith Olbermann. And I did that concurrently while writing for Boston Magazine. 93, got hired by WEI to do a talk show, and then got hired by the Herald. In the meantime, the ESPN show got canceled, and that kind of catches us up through the Herald.
What was it like working with Keith Olbermann? A well-known kind of character.
He's very intense. I actually auditioned with Keith. They brought me down for an audition. They had heard me on WEEI. I had just started there, and then a guy mentioned my name, and Vince Doria, who had been sports editor of the Globe, Vince had interviewed me for a job at the Globe, and then he hired me at the National. So Vince was familiar with me, and Vince had gone to ESPN. So Vince called me, invited me down for an audition, and they said, you're going to be auditioning with Keith Olbermann, who at the time was one of the big heavy hitters on SportsCenter. And they told me to be offbeat and different, because that's what ESPN2 was going to be. And if you Google on YouTube, the Robin Ventura and Nolan Ryan fight in 1993 had just happened, and I did a minute and a half commentary on those two guys, and that was my audition with Keith Olbermann. So, and I think Jerry's trying to join us right now.
Jerry's coming in. We'll let him in right when he gets in. But so I'm gonna ask you another question while he's going on here. Something I'm curious about. I'm not sure what the adjective for this is, but who would you say in the Boston sports media who is not your colleague at your direct employer has been your biggest, I don't know if it's closest friend, like someone that you've really built a good relationship within Boston sports media that you've never actually worked with?
Dan Shaughnessy, Bob Ryan are both very, very good friends of mine. Kevin DuPont. And again, I'm only naming people I haven't worked with. So obviously it's going to, for the purposes of answering your question, it's going to be globe centric.
Gotcha.
But Bob LaBelle from Channel 4, Danny Roach, Steve Burton from Channel 4. Then you get guys from the outlying papers, Lenny Magliola out in Framingham. Nick Cafardo, the late great Nick Cafardo, was a very dear friend of mine. I sat next to Nick in the press box for 24, 25 years. So he'd be very high up in the list, and so on.
Absolutely. So now we're welcoming in, fresh off a run and saving a dog in New Jersey, Jerry Crasnick, fellow Portlander and BU guy. So we got 3 BU alums in here now. Jerry, thanks so much. And also, of course, Jerry's the senior advisor for player and agent media relations for the MLBPA and longtime baseball writer, both at the beat level and national level. So Jerry, thanks so much for getting in here with us. And we're excited to talk the Portland Press Herald days probably for the rest of this time.
Yeah. I've been running and going through the woods and stuff all morning, and I was looking for a hat. So I figured my hair's not in a great place, but I found this thing. So I figured I also have this. So I got
the Sea Dogs.
Portland Sea Dogs regalia.
The Florida Marlins colorway too. The original.
Yeah.
03 colorway.
The hat doesn't really fit, but it's what the heck.
It's a relic.
So,
all right, so take us. So Buck was kind of catching us up on when he got to the Press Herald, which is sort of also when you got to the Press Herald out of BU. What was Press Herald sports like at that time? And this is kind of, you both can answer this question. What were you going into? What did you cover? How did your friendship and relationship build?
Well, Steve actually hired me in Biddeford. I was out of BU and I was out of school for about 2 months. And I said, I have no idea what I'm going to do. And I saw an ad it was in the Portland paper for the Journal Tribune in Biddeford. And they said it was I think it was a Sanford Bureau sports writing job. And I went down there, and Steve was there, and he was coaching I guess it was a Legion team, right? And he actually had me watch the game and write a story off the game, covering the game. And the cool part was, I think the next day, he told me I was hired, but I also had my first byline professionally in the paper, which was really amazing. I mean, back in that day, it was pretty cool. And I just remember the job was $160 a week. And so I started. I was supposed to be the Sanford Bureau person, I think, and that didn't really work out. So worked in Biddeford covering high schools and that kind of stuff. And then we both wound up gravitating to the Press Herald, and we wound up doing different things. I did a lot of University of Maine back in the day. You know, back when they had like Rick Carlisle and Champ Godbolt and some really good teams with Skip Chappelle. And then I covered the Mariners, the hockey team, and Buck did a lot of different things, but he was the first, the first AAA baseball writer. So yeah, it was an interesting day. Remember, Buck, when they were going to try to bring in a AA team in Portland. Right. What was her name? Barbara Reedman. Was that her name? I think she was
in the city council, and
she was a city councilor who just like took a stand against it and shut it down, and it was pretty heated. Like, we didn't really. It was funny because we could have actually had the team in Portland earlier, and they didn't go on to do it. And in hindsight, it would have been pretty cool if they had done it then, I think.
Yeah, I think it was Barbara Reedman and Bill Trobe, who I think later became mayor. And I think the ice arena is named after him, isn't it? And it's funny, shortly before he passed away, I actually spent some time with him in Boston. But for people who don't know, there were two groups trying to bring professional baseball in Maine. There was the AA team down in Connecticut, which was then the New Britain Red Sox. And they were going to relocate to Portland and become the Portland Red Sox. And then there was Jordan Kobritz, who was trying to bring a AAA team to Maine. Well, Portland ultimately did not put up funding to renovate Hadlock Field to bring the AA team up. And I guess they moved to Bristol, or they moved from Bristol to Britain, I forget. And then Jordan built the AAA ballpark in Old Orchard Beach, 84, 85, 86, 87. They ultimately moved to Scranton Wilkes-Barre. And then a few years later, the AA team moved up to Portland and was, as you pointed out, the Marlins for a few years. So it was an interesting time in professional baseball in Maine.
So what was the Press Herald like sports staff like at that time? How many people were on it?
It was Kraz and everybody else.
It was Buck who, about a year after there, was like sending out resumes to every paper in the country.
Well, I'm going to throw us both under the bus. We would both go in on Sunday mornings. I don't know if you remember this, and use those IBM Selectrics in the newsroom to write cover letters. And Jerry and I were applying for every big paper job in the country. And I swear I have the rejection letters. I must have 50 of them in a file down in my cellar. You know, we regret to inform you that while you show great promise, we don't have any openings at this time. And
the funny thing is, we laugh at it now, but for me, I mean, I think I would have been happy working there. It's just that was my hometown, and I guess I was afraid that if I just went back to my hometown, I would just never leave. So, but in hindsight, back then there were Dick Doyle and Vern Putney who had been there for decades, and they were really the face of Portland sports coverage. Just these amazing, iconic local figures. Tommy Chard was there covering all the local stuff. He was a great golfer. And then we had some other guys, Augie Favazza, who was from St. Louis, he was a University of Missouri guy. He was our editor. Alan Lessels, good friend of ours from New Hampshire. And some other guys, Tom Welch from Saco, Larry Woodward. He was a big yacht sailing guy. We'd go in and there was like a sports department. They moved it a couple times, but there was just a place you'd go in and everybody would go in and you do your work. You try to get the plum parking spots, remember, around the building, where there would be like the 6 all-day parking spots. And if you drove in and you got it, you wouldn't leave like unless there was a death in the family or something.
You just didn't. This was the early 80s, and times were different, and you could just walk in off the street, go in the side door on Exchange Street and go up to the 3rd floor, walk down the hall and go into sports. And we had no shortage of characters that would just, and I'll take you through them. There's Eddie Griffin from South Portland. He owned a bar. He would come in with big proclamations like, "I'm never going to go to a Red Sox game again." And we all loved Eddie.
It would be like Eddie was a chain smoker also. So you could tell when he was coming in because there was like this miasma of like smoke in front of him, around him.
And it was Julius
Wow.
Silverman, who was the mayor of Congress Street. And Julius was kind of a bereft little guy in a big long overcoat who would come in, and he'd come in on Saturday mornings, and I was Sunday editor for a while, and I'd be laying out advance pages, and I would give him money to go out to the deli across the street to get a couple of bagels and coffee, and I'd always say, "Keep the change." And I don't know if you remember, Jerry, but Julius died and left almost $1 million in a savings account at Maine National Bank. It was like, and I'm like, and some third cousin in New Hampshire got all the money, which pissed me off.
Eddie Sullivan, Expo Eddie.
Expo Eddie. And he
used to go out, and Eddie was this really sweet kid. He had Down syndrome, and he used to go out, run out in the middle of the games and get the tea, football games and bring them back. He was a sweet guy. He used to come in, and Dan Gazzetta was the head of the
Maine Sports Hall of Fame.
Maine Sports Hall of Fame would come in, and I mean, Pete Riccatelli, the boxer, like he would
come in
around. There were all these sort of local.
Don't forget the wrestler, pro wrestler, Jackie Nichols.
Oh, okay, right, yeah.
In his 80s, he was a former professional wrestler.
Right.
Like, we had pictures of him with the cape and the mask and everything. Back in the 1950s, but these were people that would come in every day, just wander in, and they'd sit
Lloyd Johnson from the racetrack. He'd in and deliver the race results.
Downs.
Yeah, there was always like a Scarborough Downs person. There was
we were there yesterday. We went in that
a Beach Ridge Speedway person. It really was sort of it was kind of like Cheers, without the sitting at the end of the bar. But it was a fun. I mean, Buck, remember the time we had we had this amazing, just unbelievable snowstorm one year, and we went
home.
None of us could leave because there were like 6 feet of snow around our cars. So we went down to like, what was it, the Legion or the Elks Club or whatever it is?
Labor Temple.
Yeah, whatever it was. And we just went to about different like establishments. And by the end of the night, we're throwing snowballs at each other. And I don't know, we wound up sleeping at somebody's place, but there was a real sense of collegiality to the place.
It's funny when I look back on it, it sounds like we're talking about the 1940s instead of the 1980s. That it just seems that kind of thing isn't going to happen anymore because I mean, I don't have an office to go to anymore, but even with the Herald and the Globe, I don't think if you went to the Herald and Globe right now, you could wander in off the street and go in the sports department. It just doesn't. That's not the way it works anymore. And these people, and these are just the ones that came in all the time. There'd always be the person that only came in once, arguing about, I want to talk to the sports editor, our from Bonnie Eagle High School, our games aren't getting covered or something. I mean, that would happen. That was cool stuff.
So at the time when you guys were there, who were like the local legends, whether they were high school athletes, college athletes, like who were the people that people wanted to know about or what they were doing or what schools, what teams,
I'm going to throw that to Jerry because he's from Portland. And
well, the other thing I want to mention though was like a couple of other things I remember were Friday night we would be sitting there and it'd be like calling in, the South Portland Chevrolet basketball game.
Yeah.
And it'd be like Danny Costigan,
Costigan, yeah.
6 field goals, 2 free throws, 14 points. And we would take the whole thing. And, there were local guys. I mean, I remember I went to Portland High School and remember after I left, there was that, what was it? Sean Hawkins and Kevin Fifield, I think the 2 kids from Portland. I think Portland won a state championship.
Hawkins went to Cornell, I think. And
Yeah, Mike Rutherford, who, he was the quarterback for those teams. A lot of those guys wound up staying and becoming, teachers and coaches. Who was the other kid? Al Bugby, and who was the other kid? There were a couple basketball players from Portland.
I remember Joyce from Deering, Kenny Joyce.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of kids just. I remember like going to a basketball game, and Skip Chappelle, who was the University of Maine coach, was sitting there like scouting, and Danny Costigan was this little guard from Cheverus, and he drives down the court like Danny Ainge, and he's probably 6'1", and Skip Chappelle looks at me and he's like this kid's pretty good, not quite good enough maybe to play at UMaine, but there are, who was the kids in Biddeford? I mean, they were good in football then.
Dennis Gadboy.
Dennis Gadboy, Claude Leclerc was
the running back.
the kids who won the Fitzpatrick Award.
Dennis.
A lot of those guys.
Dennis
was like
played,
what?
Dennis played at.
It was like Rufus Harris was a big basketball player at Maine, and then there was Rick Carlisle and Jeff Cross and Champ Godbolt, and they had some really good teams. Remember Lorenzo Bouyer? He was the running back at Maine. Ron Rogerson came in and installed the wing T.
At Rogo.
It was like UMaine was big, a lot of high schools. But even back then, there was an awful lot of Red Sox love. It was mostly a lot of people were into the Red Sox and the Bruins and the Celtics. Larry Bird.
We had some guys that played in the pros. Dennis Gadboy out of Biddeford went to BU when they had football, and he played a little bit with the Patriots as a wide receiver. He lives in Texas now. Billy Swift, South Portland High, played in the big leagues, had a very good big league career.
Peter Adams
played pro ball, shortstop, Portland High. Eric Weinrich had a very good NHL career as a hockey player. And Joe Johnson, University of Maine. He's not from Maine, but he played in the big leagues.
Brad Colton, Mark Sweeney.
Yeah, all those Maine teams in 82, 83, 84, 85 were the best.
That was a huge thing at the time because, and Buck would cover a lot of those games. But I remember a game where you might have covered it, Buck, where it was like Billy Swift threw 191 pitches, I think, in a
Friday night against Providence at McCoy Stadium.
In a regional. And I vividly remember this. Nobody had cable then. So I think Buck was in Omaha, but I remember going out to Shakey's Pizza in Westbrook, and they could show the games.
Yeah.
I went out there and got pizza and beer, and we watched Maine. And Scott Morse, I think that was the kid who pitched for them. Mark Powers, who was the kid from Deering. And those teams, like the whole state, would just get around because they were a lot of local kids. The other guy who was a local legend at the time, remember, was the golfer Mark Plummer. He was this big burly redheaded guy with a big walrus mustache, and he used to win the Maine Open every year. And so there were a lot of guys like that. I mean, it was kind of a mostly high school, college stuff, but there was an awful lot of people who had their hearts with the Red Sox and the Bruins and the Celtics.
So did you guys do any, I mean, obviously, like, you drove up to Bangor and Orono for UMaine stuff. Did either of you go down to Boston? Did you do any Red Sox?
Yeah, all the time. Yeah, we both, I think it, correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry, I think we might have done that as an extracurricular activity. I know I did. And Jerry, we would just take days off and get down to Fenway and put in for a press pass and write stories that were, they were good reads for the paper, but they were also helpful to us because we're covering in its fashion big league sports. And I can't speak for Jerry, but I'd get down to Fenway and I'd be scared to death because you'd walk into that clubhouse and it's Yastrzemski and Jim Rice and I I would stand like 5 back in the crowd there and not ask any questions because I was too afraid. I think I asked one question once and I got my head bit off. So um, uh, I remember I was doing a big piece on Yaz when he was going to retire. And I took a deep breath. I went up to Yaz and I said, I'm Steve Buckley from the Portland Press Herald. And I'd like to interview you for a story I'm doing in your retirement. And he said, sure. And then I said, oh, great. So when you first came to the big leagues, whatever the question was, and he looked at me and he goes, not now. And he turned his back on me and I didn't know, and I've gotten to know him. He's a dear guy. And I've done many pieces on him over the years, but he treated me then the way you treat 23-year-olds who are working in Portland, Maine. You don't know them. And there's something, you asked me before about relationships and sources. You get those by being around and people get to know you. And I remember something Peter Gammon said years and years and years ago. You don't always have to have your notebook out when you're talking to an athlete. Sometimes just say, hey, how you doing? And Greg, I mentioned finding the commonality. I remember when John Lester got called up to the big leagues, I went right up to him and introduced myself. And I said, I want you to know I'm the only guy in Boston that can pronounce your hometown correctly. It's Puyallup. Because I worked for the Tacoma News Tribune, and the next town over was Puyallup, which was the site of the Washington State Fair. And in Washington, you don't go to the state fair. The local lingo is, are you doing the Puyallup? Hey, you're going to do the Puyallup this year? That's a local lingo. And so I shared that with John Lester, and right away he knows who I am. And when you're 23 coming down from Portland, you can't really do that. You have to do it in little fits and starts.
I did I covered the 86 World Series. I mean, I was at the Press Herald sitting out in the right field foul pole, watching the ball go through Buckner's legs. I mean,
Wow.
and, it was really cool. I remember doing a story on how talking to Mainers who were waiting for the streak to get end. Remember my friends, Steve, Denny, Welch, and all those guys?
And Dollar Bill and
they had a bottle of champagne ready, and somebody opened the bottle before like when the Red Sox were leading and jinxed it. And I wound up talking to 5 or 6 different people locally about how they dealt with the heartache of that thing. And I remember for this story, they talked about how they had this open bottle of champagne and they all walked out onto the lawn and just poured it out on the lawn because they had opened it prematurely. But those are the kinds of stories I always thought were cool, just like how the Maine fans deal with Red Sox heartache. Those are the kinds of things that, you can write the regular story, but those are the types of stories I think we always wanted to do too at the time, because we were New Englanders, even though Steve's from, Massachusetts, we could relate to that whole thing. So it was fun. I mean, it just seemed more fun back in the day. There was more camaraderie. The technology was so bad. Like you'd send it by like a fax type machine. And if it didn't go through, you would dictate. I mean, it was horrible technologically, but
telegrams.
Oh God, you'd have a story like 3/4 of the way written. And some dolt would like walk behind you and kick out the plug. It was
Story's gone.
Oh God, it was just things like that. Or these porta bubbles where you put the phone in these little bubbles and you'd wait like 20 minutes for it to transmit. I mean, I remember covering the Maine Mariners and going to like Sherbrooke and Halifax and Moncton and these places and write an AM story on deadline. And then all the players would be on the bus saying, Scoop, like they called me Scoop, hurry up, get on the bus. I'd get on the bus, we'd get to the next town, and at 3 a.m, I would write my afternoon story and send it in.
Yes.
Actually, Buck, one of the greatest things ever was when Buck wound up playing goal for the Mariners magazine story. and
Uh-huh.
spent like what, a month working out with the team and played in the game and everything. It was pretty cool.
I have the story up right,
You
right up
played in
there.
a game?
Huh?
An
You played in a
exhibition game.
Wow.
Exhibition game. Yeah, 7 minutes and 21 seconds in the
You
net.
made a save or two, right?
I made one save off a guy named Dunk McIntyre. Oh, he scored the goal. I made a save. I don't know who I got the save off of. It was a kick save and a beauty. And then Dunk McIntyre came across the from one circle to the other and fired a wrist shot that I never saw. And one of the things I learned, you can stop a professional hockey player's slap shot, believe it or not. I mean, there are guys you can't stop, but I had better luck with slap shots in practice than wrist shots because the wrist shot is just like a little hummingbird. It's a and it's like the guy is like snapping his wrist and it's already past you. Is what they are able to do with those hockey pucks is amazing. But yeah, that was a fun little interactive exercise.
So did they know? When you were playing in that game, did they know who you were? Like the
Oh
other
yeah,
team?
no, this was all
It was announced and everything, right? Yeah.
yeah. I worked out with them for like 3 or 4 weeks in training camp at the Civic Center, and then when they went up to Maine, they played some exhibition games in those towns, Sherbrooke and Freddie, and then they came down to Old Town, the at the Soccer Alexis Ice Arena, and they played an exhibition game against the Fredericton Express, and they told Freddie beforehand that they were going to suit up an extra goalie, and so they were aware of it. The referee was Paul Stewart, longtime NHL referee. Dale Arnold was there, and Jerry, I don't even know if you know this, but one of the opposing players for Fredericton was Claude Julien, who was
Yeah.
later a longtime coach of the Bruins, and I didn't know for years. You know, he had been coaching the Bruins for 2 or 3 years, and I did a story on him once, and I told him that story, and then Claude goes, "Oh, I remember I was in that game," and I looked it up, and I played hockey against Claude Julien. It was crazy.
Barry Melrose was in that league, like the Wayne Gretzky's coach and the the ESPN guy,
Yeah.
player in that league. The Mariners stuff was fun because, I mean, Tom McVie, who's a friend of both of ours, and I just spoke with him the other day for the first time in years. He's 85.
You called Tommy?
I did, yeah.
Oh.
He was basically, Tom was the guy who was sort of the inspiration for Paul Newman and Slapshot, I guess, right? And he used to, remember Billy, the bus driver?
Wild Bill Anderson.
Billy Anderson would drive the bus 10 or 12 hours, and he would fall asleep about 6 times on these dark roads. And you'd hear a little buzz, and Tom would yell, "Billy," really loud, and he'd get him to go back on the highway.
Yeah.
I mean, there were probably 24 times we could have plunged into a woods or something easily. The Mariners teams were fun, and then Buck and I got to cover. Buck did more than me, but when Maine got the AAA team, those teams were pretty fun too. Doc Edwards and
Jerry and I were both very lucky in that we covered minor league hockey, minor league baseball at a time when Tom McVie was coaching Portland, the Mariners, and Doc Edwards was managing the Maine Guides. They were wonderfully anecdotal, and they were kind of the same person. Doc played a little bit in the big leagues, but he was a minor league lifer, as was Tommy. And Tommy had a much longer NHL head coaching career than Doc did. He briefly managed the Cleveland Indians, but Doc had a big league playing career. So they both had a wealth of information and knowledge, and they liked both of us collectively. And we both rode buses with those guys, and it was hugely entertaining and educational to listen to those guys tell their stories.
So were you two, or like when at a Mariners game or a Guides game, how many other reporters were there? Like how many total reporters would there be? Would it just be you guys, or would there be more?
When I was at the hockey games, what was it? Maybe like somebody from Biddeford, maybe like Patty Singer or Sam Ellen or somebody, like occasionally, but there weren't many. I mean, honestly, it was me in there, and at the end of the game, you'd be the guy who'd pick the 3 stars, you know? And so, yeah, I mean, it guides games. I don't remember, Buck. I guess the Biddeford paper would be there
The
probably.
Journal Tribune, because it was York County, they either, what's her name? Nancy Story,
Yeah.
Charlotte McAtee, and later Patty Singer. So they did Maine Guides games. But you wouldn't get the, Greg, if you're talking about like the KJ and the Sentinel and the Lewis.
Or
and
even
Son-
like, I don't know, even like if there was anything else at that time.
No, there's no like missing paper that what you would be more often be more likely to get. Well, first of all, there'd be the visiting guy.
Right.
I think Glens Falls had a guy that traveled. When I did the Maine Guides, the Tom Hodricourt traveled with the Richmond Braves.
Yeah.
Columbus had Bob Hunter that traveled.
Yeah.
And what's his name in Tidewater? George McClellan.
Yeah.
Yeah, and who went to Colby, I believe. And
Yeah.
and he was older guy, like in his 60s back then. And the other thing is, every once in a while, I'd get all excited because one of the Boston guys would come up to the ballpark or to the Civic Center, and I remember, like, way back before I even got to Maine, I was covering the Whalers when I was at the Westfield Evening News. I was the UPI stringer doing Whalers games the last year of the WHA, and they announced the merger, and a lot of media came out from Boston because they announced the NHL WHA merger, and I remember being so excited that all these Boston sports writers were in the press room at the Springfield Civic Center. And I'll never forget, I think I've told you this, Steve Morantz came out from the Globe to write a story, and he's writing his story, and he turns, and I've known Steve for years, but he turns, he goes, "Hey, what's the name of this place anyway?" And I was so pissed off because I was so provincial, because I'm working in Springfield. And the same token, if someone had come to the ballpark of the Civic Center and said, "What's the name of this place anyway?" I would have been so upset, because at the time I was covering the Whalers were my team. When I was covering the Guides and the Mariners, I get very proprietary about it. And for someone to say, "Hey, what's the name of this place?" I'm small town sensibilities and sensitivities and so forth. So
it was just different then, because like I covered the AAA team when they were the Indians, and then you left, I think. And when I covered them, they were the Phillies AAA team. But the thing was, like, the beat writers in Philly were Jason Stark and Paul Hagen and these guys. And like, they would call you to find out what was going on with the AAA team.
yeah.
And so I said, well, geez, the more I can. And then a job came open in Cincinnati, and the editors said, yeah, I talked to Jason Stark and Paul Hagen and these guys. And so that was back in the day when you could kind of work your way up from being a AAA writer. It was almost like being a player. You'd be the AAA guy. And it's funny, conversely, like when I went to Cincinnati to cover the Reds, the AAA team was Nashville. And I was talking to this young kid in Nashville, and I said, "This kid's unbelievable. Like, he knows everything that goes on there." It was Buster Olney. I said, "This guy knows like everything before everybody." So I started telling people, like, this guy's going to be a real star in this business. And the next thing you know, like, I'm working in Cincinnati and he's at the New York Times.
Like, Jerry sees him now, and Buster says, "What's your name again, sir?"
No, but and then we worked together at ESPN, but like, I could tell, he'd say like, "This guy's locker has been cleared out and he's open."
I did that.
And I would get scoops, I would get news because he would say, "This guy's being called up," and so forming a relationship with a AAA writer was really cool. I don't think that's really done anymore.
I'll give you a quick example of that. I was in the Maine Guides, and remember Brian Clark, the lefty, and I used to call Sheldon Ocker from the Akron Beacon Journal and Hoynesy and those guys, but I had a good relationship with Sheldon, and I walk into the clubhouse one day, and Brian Clark's locker everything is gone. And I talked to Doc and I said, oh, I don't know. And Doc couldn't tell me anything. So I called up Sheldon and I said, hey, I just want you to know Brian Clark's locker is empty and he's gone. And then I think Stevie says on the train, he said, yeah, he's going to Cleveland. And so Sheldon was able to, not that it's, the Hindenburg or anything, but Sheldon was able to break the news that Brian Clark was on the way to Cleveland. And similarly, when I got to Seattle, I made it, our AAA team was Calgary in the PCL. And I made it my business to get to know the AAA writer. And the AAA guy in Calgary told me, geez, the big league writers in Seattle won't give me the time of day. And I said, no, I would like to call you now and then. And then I called him one night and the exact same thing happened in reverse. He said, well, Lee Guterman, also a lefty, his locker is empty. And I was able to get Dick Williams aside and I said, well, yeah. So I was able to break the news. Again, it's not the biggest news of the world, but when in the competition of being a big league beat writer, I was able to break the stunning news that the Mariners had called up Lee Guterman from Calgary. So.
Awesome. Well, it was a great conversation. Great to hear from both of you about your experiences up. I mean, I know I was looking forward to this so much because obviously I'm a Portland guy and didn't see the Press Herald when you guys were there, of course, but it's always fun to hear those stories. Again, Steve Buckley, columnist and all type of feature writer for The Athletic, Jerry Crasnick, the senior advisor for player and agent media relations with the MLBPA. And of course, both of you have been a lot of other places and done a lot of other things. Thanks so much for joining us. We really enjoyed it.
Can we do this again and talk about the Waterville City Council meetings that you cover? Or?
Yeah, we can do that. I don't know. I mean, sure, we'll go for it.
Hey, look, I mean, Steve Kornacki is like the king of the election season and he's a Terrier, right? So
never know.
Good.
Great. That was awesome. Thanks so
much. A little
much.
Younger than us, but he was great. So, but that was fun, guys. Thanks. We
See you, Kraz.